And finally, for the first time, we heard from the police officer at the center of the storm. Darren Wilson, who resigned from the force this weekend, sat down with ABC's George Stephanopoulos. Joining us now to examine how the media covered this racially charged case and the violent aftermath, David Webb, who hosts a Sirius XM radio show and is a Fox News contributor. David Zurich, television and media critic at the Baltimore Sun. And Mara Eliason of National Public Radio, also a Fox News contributor. David Webb, what was it like being on the Ferguson streets night after night? And did you have much contact with the people who were engaging in some of the violence and troublemaking?
I had a lot of contact. Howard, I was there in August. I spoke to the rioters then. I interviewed a lot of them. We have a lot of that file tape. I also was in the middle of the scrum, in the middle of the looting, in the middle of the tear gas, all of this in Ferguson. I was right there next to the police station on South Florissant. Bottles flying overhead. We heard the initial gunshots. Of course, then the looting began further down South Florissant. And a lot of this spurred on by a lot of the lie that began with hands up, don't shoot.
Well, we'll come back to that, but was it strange, surreal, scary to be there right so up close, not just with tear gas going off, but with people that you were talking to one minute who end up getting arrested the next?
I wouldn't go with scary. I'd say be cautious. We had security with us. I was wearing a bulletproof vest. You know, you do what you can, but our job is there to report on it, to get the story. I talked to people of all kinds, angry protesters, concerned residents who'd lived there for 70 years, young people, some of whom confronted me, whether they don't like Fox or they do or otherwise, they recognize me. But at no point in that initial phase was it scary. I don't know if it's scary. What got worse is that eventually when people start looting and moving, that means everything's a target, including people running through the crowds with dogs, with pit bulls.
Right. Z, how did the cable networks do on that night, especially in the violent aftermath of the announcement?
Well, Howie, look, there's a lot of particular problems and criticisms I have, but the one thing I think is really absolutely important for us, cable news was there to bear witness to us. I would pay anything for that split screen that you showed to see what was going on. Cable news was the operation that dug in, brought us that story, when the networks really didn't pay much, sort of came in and out, didn't pay much attention to it. That's good. I did have some problems with people. I had problems with CNN, for example, having a political commentator, one of the political commentators, Van Jones, out on the street with reporters. I thought in a situation like this, you need journalists. That's what you need. And you need your best journalist, your most experienced journalist, because it's hard enough to get verified information in a normal setting. This might not be Gaza last summer, but it's scary, you know, and you're out there, you have no time to react. They have to process information. And what we in the public needed was real information, not spin from one side or the other, not somebody saying, oh, this is just a small group of knuckleheads, as Van Jones did say. It wasn't. We know that.
When the prosecutor said that his biggest problem was the nonstop media coverage and social media, did he have an important point?
It probably was a problem for him, but that is what we've got today. We've got nonstop, wall-to-wall coverage, and we've got social media. There's absolutely nothing he can do about it. I actually thought that was a little gratuitous. I mean, that's not his biggest problem. He was supposed to be finding the facts and presenting it to a grand jury. He did something pretty unusual. He didn't make a recommendation to the grand jury, as most prosecutors do. So I think for him to blame his problems on the media, I think is unfair.
Now let's go back to the early media narrative, which was basically all about Michael Brown as the innocent victim of a rogue cop. We've learned a lot more since then, but did journalists, looking back now with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of this evidence, rush to judgment?
Yes, they did. Without a doubt, they did. They started from the initial gentle giant approach. Then, of course, hands up, don't shoot again, which I said was a lie cooked up by Dorian Johnson, who was his accomplice. So now you have a narrative they can drive. The family contributed to this in part, at least their lawyers did, because they brought in Sean Parcell, a, quote, pathologist or medical investigator who turns out to be a fraud, who was on many of the networks pushing this narrative of being shot in the back. And then, of course, that got refuted. So the media played played into this because it fit their narrative. MSNBC did a horrible job. CNN did not do a great job. Fox, to our credit, not just because I work here, did a much more fair job of presenting the facts, and were actually attacked for demanding the due process play out.
Right. Now, Mara, I mean, there has been conflicting testimony now that we see what was told to the grand jury. But there was also forensic evidence he was not shot in the back, according to the early narrative. But there's different, was he charging the officer, was he not? But the problem in those early weeks, and I talked about this at the time, is that Darren Wilson wasn't telling his side. Neither was the Ferguson Police Department. So the people the media had access to were Michael Brown's family, his allies, and people sympathetic to him. But that did create or foster a one-sided view.
Yeah, and is that the media's fault or the fact that those people chose not to tell their side of the story? Look, we know now he wasn't shot in the back, but when you read that grand jury testimony, it's still very ambivalent. You know, did he have to be shot in the head? Could he have been shot in the legs? Could he have been told, you know, lie down on the ground? There were a lot of things that are still questions. And that, I think, means that this is an ongoing story that deserves a lot of attention, not just the circumstances of his death, Michael Brown's death, but also all of the other things that contribute to this. You know, why are police forces in black communities mostly white? I mean, there's a lot of things that can be discussed in a serious, sober way going forward.
And I agree with Mara. We need to have those discussions, but those discussions...
There has been some good reporting, I think, on those broader questions.
I think so, too.
But let me come to you, David, and that is, we didn't even know until late in the process that there had been this altercation in the police car, that shots had been fired. I mean, it was completely changed our understanding of what happened in the run-up to that shooting. So where are you on this question of whether the media were too quick to embrace a one-sided narrative, even though we all knew as journalists that there was a lot that we had not yet found out during those early weeks?
Listen, I think the journalist's job in a situation like that is to not buy into a narrative. It makes it easier, especially for cable news coverage, which is rolling, and you sort of need a narrative to process the information. But on something like that, Howie, you have to get back to this notion of here is what we know to be true, and don't go beyond what you know to be true. It happened in the criminal justice system to some extent, but it mostly happened in the journalistic system. And how people don't even know anymore what journalism is, what a tough process and how much training it takes to process this information and to stop yourself from saying stuff that you don't know to be true because it sounds good.
And the other layer here, obviously, David Webb, is that the media coverage, which was divisive, in my view, to some degree, also fueled an obvious racial divide over Ferguson. I mean, just to pick one poll, Huffington Post, 64% of blacks say Officer Wilson was at fault, 22% of whites. Do you agree that the media deepened the racial tension here?
Yeah, I do believe they did, and I'll go to some of what David said. We have a job to report. I don't have a dog in this hunt when I go down there to cover the story. But media took what was a criminal event, and because of the white officer and the black youth, turned it into a racial divide. This didn't start out in any manner that we now know from the grand jury testimony from the witnesses based on color. It started out based on a bolo alert of someone who had robbed the store and an officer who happened to be white who observed that or observed the Michael Brown, saw the cigarillos and thought, let me question this person who's walking down the middle of the street.
So do the media, as so often in these racially charged cases, take a local crime, make it a national story, and kind of exploit it for ratings and clicks?
Sure, sure. But you know what? These are becoming a national story because every one of these is different. But when you have a series of unarmed black teenagers being killed by white police officers, regardless of the difference of their circumstances, it is a national story, and it deserves attention, proper attention.
Let me briefly put up some New York Times video that everybody used of Michael Brown's stepfather engaged in what can only be described as a rant. Should that have been shown? Was that news?
I thought when I was reviewing that evening, I didn't write about it because I didn't know the facts, but I thought that the cable channels weren't showing that because they thought it was so inflammatory and they were holding it back. I saw it everywhere the next day.
Yeah. Well, that may have been a good...
But you know what? David explained to me how that started, and he was standing nearby, and the crews couldn't get in there right away to film it. That's what it was.